Good evening. This is Group A, the Straight A's, and today we are going to be discussing some very critical topics. But before we begin, I'd like to address some very constructive criticism we were given last time. It's something we're going to do better today on. So before we were essentially told that we needed to challenge each other more, be a little more critical, and have a little more argumentation because we were agreeing way too much. In today's readings and analysis, we will be arguing a little more. We will be discussing each other's principles and topics on a more critical level. And we'll also stay on central topics more. That was a problem before us that we sort of jumped around, but I think today we'll really stay focused. So to begin, we have Mr. Ramos beginning with his post. So
yeah, I did I kind of want to talk about Mr. Boland's post, Artificial Men. Pretty much, he talks about Rousseau things like how we're artificial men, like we've changed, we've become soulless, and like this whole idea of like nihilism. And then he ends with something like, it's like, with a question, should we all just embrace nihilism and come to the realization life is meaningless if we are to accept Rousseau's revolution? Well, first of all, I just want to ask Mr. Boland, it's like, do you think life is meaningless? Because like I believe that as a society, as a species, we've changed. We've become much more like social creatures, more like ambition. Like I don't think, it's come to like, we've changed. We're not natural man. It's nothingness.
Yeah,
I think we're a whole different breed.
No, I absolutely do not believe or buy into Rousseau's thing that we're artificial men. But that whole post, basically, what I was trying to address was if Rousseau does think that if he thinks we're artificial men, and because of that we're somehow completely foreign, cut off from our past, and that somehow makes us, I don't want to say less than, but we're so different that it stops us from really understanding who we are, and that makes us artificial, he says. But if that's the case, if we are artificial men, as he says, then what's the point of things, right? Because it's simplistic. Artificial, the definition tells you all you need to know, right? It's not like the real thing. And if that's the case, I figured, well, if he's arguing that men are artificial, someone needs to buy into that concept, and they also concurrently would have to buy into the concept that, well, then, like, what's the point of doing things? But I personally, no, I don't think that life is meaningless. I don't believe in nihilism. I don't buy Rousseau's point, because even though he makes a lot of good points, especially in this section, page 65 to 68 especially, but overall, I think he's misguided. I don't think that we are necessarily artificial men. We've changed, we've developed, yes, but sometimes that's swing the button.
I would agree that he does kind of have an attitude like we're just inevitably going to be unequal and take rights away from each other, and we've strayed really far from our natural, like, savage man where we were equal. And he doesn't really give us a chance to say, like, but, maybe we could get better. He makes it seem like we're inevitably going to be unequal. But yeah. I don't agree with that. Like you said, I think that even if you look at our own history, we've made a lot of progress in more equality in society. And like, what would Rousseau have to say about that? Like, what does that show?
Yeah, I also think that if you know that it is a problem in your society, that inequality becomes an issue, and you keep that in mind as you do things, I think that you're less likely to repeat the same mistakes. So he says that we're going to get caught up in the 3 revolutions, and there's going to be a continuous cycle. But will that still happen if we know what the problem is, and we know that this is something that we have to watch out for and, get away from?
I agree, and I also think that Rousseau, he kind of almost pictures it to be in like a non-ending cycle, because in that section, I know he talks about how a new state of nature will come about, and then he kind of hints that it's just going to like all repeat itself. So I think he just has this one idea, and he's not really considering the other options that may occur, since we are human beings, and often we'll change to what people think we're going to do. We'll do something completely different. So you can never know for certain like where we're going to end up.
And he even says that a lot of times people fight inequality, but it's only for their own gain. But you can even look at our own past and see if that's not true. Like, what would the people running like the Underground Railroad, what were they really gaining out of helping the slaves run away? Really, they were just risking their own lives, their property, their fortunes, their everything to help somebody else, and they really didn't get any gain from that. So you can see that there are changes that people aren't making for their own gain; they're doing it to help others.
yeah. But to offer the contrary side to this, like, people are like inherently good in some sense, but I do think that people do things for sort of the publicity purposes, and they do things to sort of be the big guy and be the guy that's changing the world, So to offer the contrary, I think people can be very manipulative. Okay.
So moving on to my question.
Yes.
Okay.
I know this.
So my blog post, or not my blog post, but the blog post I wanted to talk about was Mr. Tom Nix, and he was discussing what he found in the Federalist Papers on factions. And so he kind of explains what they were saying about factions and how they deter liberty. And so he says that the government should include all interests in order to deter factions from taking away liberty. So my question is, does including all interests really secure liberty? And will liberty and inequality, or lack of liberty and inequality, still, become a part of our society even with these safeguards against it?
I think that by just including all groups into, like, let's say, to include all, can you repeat the first part of your question? I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. So does including all interests into a government really
Okay.
secure liberty?
Yeah, and I would say no, I don't think that liberty can be secured just by including all groups into government, because if you take present day examples and even historical examples, there can be times where groups, everyone's represented, doesn't mean they're represented equally, doesn't mean they're represented fairly, doesn't mean that their voice is going to be heard. A lot of times it can be drowned out. So I would say I don't think that liberty can always be safeguarded in such a way. You need to have more steps, more precautions, more balances.
And there's also a problem where some people's interests and some opinions can be directly taken away from other people's liberties. Like if you had a politician who were constantly listening to like the opinions of the KKK, that's obviously going to have problems and infringe on other people's liberty.
I also think it's like impossible for every group to be represented. You can't represent every group, and even if like you try, there's always going to be the group that like is left out, or sort of like creates a group that's left out because they want to be left out.
No, I think it's possible.
Yeah, so I just think that like, yeah, liberty can't always be represented in that way because people are always going to reject liberty too.
So what about, in a more specific sense, the representative government that the founding fathers have set up today? Because obviously, if you include all interest into a government, that's like democracy, and they warned us against democracy, that unchecked it can, go against people, minorities' rights.
Yeah.
So what about a representative system? Like, do you guys think that even that will secure liberty, or do you think that will have issues too?
No, I mean, I think like you can never fully secure liberty. It's never guaranteed, and it's never fully going to be there all the time. So I think we can even have like representation of the minority, representation of the majority, in sort of like the same sense that we have in our government. But you're always going to have people who aren't represented due to whatever factors would say contribute to inequality, like wealth or essentially even poverty. So
And I think the system itself, if it was designed, the way that it is designed, if it all worked perfectly, it really would protect everybody's ideals and opinions. But the problem is that it's run by imperfect humans. So there's going to be your politician who is directly like representing and voting on all the for the factions who are giving him money for his campaigns and issues like that. And that's where there's going to be problems.
Most definitely.
Definitely. So also just one last thing, what you were saying, Ms. Henneman, that would mean that, the main goal of government was to protect people's liberties. But if, going off of what you said, that means that governments were created to do the one thing that they cannot do.
Oh no! I think that I think you got misunderstood. I think the creation of government is what you said. I think that the creation and the sort of like first principle was there.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Yeah,
But I think that, is it impossible for them to do the job that they were created to do?
essentially I think it is. I think it's to do it well. I think it can be done in a sort of sense, but to do it well, or which would essentially be supporting doing it at all, I think it is impossible. So we can get close to the thing, which is good, but we can never get fully there, and that's where the problems arise.
I think that's right, and I think part of the problem that we can't get fully there is that no matter how much we want to believe that people are completely selfless, they're not. Everyone has at least a little bit of selfishness in them, and I think that's part of the reason that governments don't always work out the way they're planned, is because those people, as you pointed out, are imperfect, and that's why it's never going to work fully. But I still think we can make the best of the situation as we can, and I don't think when people try and attack the situation and try and like pull it down, do not help. I think there are better ways that they could contribute. Excuse me.
Well, I don't know, like, how would you try and make the best of the situation? I don't see anywhere where you can like get the best out of a situation like this. Like, how would you go around?
So working with your representative, like, really, I guess people often like vote or don't vote or just vote off of like a name that they're familiar with. I would say like really keeping watch on your representative and like how you kind of said, like working not just to pull down the government, but pull down your representative and find somebody who you really think is doing a good job.
And accountability. Yeah.
All right, so moving on to the next person, Ms. Noreen.
I wanted to talk about Mr. Boland's post, A False Hope, where he talks about Nietzsche and the monumental history. And he says how it kind of gives people a false hope and how that could possibly be detrimental. And it's a false hope because it's history written by like the people who win. People look at it and say like, oh, if they did that, I can follow in there. Things do that. But I also want to point out that Nietzsche says that we also look back at the misfortune of others as a teacher and a model. So how would looking at other people's failures as written by these victors who would probably highlight all the things that they did wrong, how would that change this false hope? And is the false hope even always a bad thing to look to?
Yeah, see, that's one of the things I wanted to really touch upon on my blog, just because I do think that there is a false hope that monumental history can give, but does that mean it's always necessarily a bad thing? No, because what I talked about in my post-op was how monumental history really aids the people up top and also the people below, because they need something to keep them driving, to keep them living day to day, right? They need some sort of inspiration of, I can do better than what I'm currently at, and I think really monumental hope can give that to them. So I would say I don't think it's always a bad thing. It's not always an accurate or fair representation of what real history is, but that doesn't necessarily make it unworthy. It still has value because it gives people hope, I think, in a way.
I mean, I think that the fact that it's in here is one of the types of history that is actually useful and necessary for life, kind of proves your point that like it does have good points, or it's good, but also there can be issues with it when it has too much power over the other two types of history, and so.
I think that it's when it becomes bad is when that people get discouraged because of it. Because oftentimes people will be extremely motivated by something, but if they can't achieve it when they want to, they will get very discouraged and almost quit. And I think that's when it becomes bad, because then it starts becoming detrimental to life, which is what Nietzsche doesn't like about history, is when it starts not serving life and almost taking away from it. So I think it's a good thing as long as there's a motivator, as long as it stays encouraging and not become negative.
And I think that's part of the thing, because you could say it's a really bad thing, monumental history, but if you said that, you'd only be looking at the side for the sake of history. Well, history for the sake of history, right? Nietzsche, I don't think he'd be in favor of that. He'd be, how does it serve fellow man? And that's the thing, I think. So if you view it from just purely history, you would say, oh, it's bad, because it's not a fair representation. But if you say, well, how does it affect the other man? It can be a good thing.
Well, yeah, being that this is like the intro kind of, I think you can talk about it in like more vague terms, but I think what he's trying to say is, and he doesn't really explicitly use the word excess, but I think he means that like any of these three types of history, like used in excess, will sort of be detrimental to the current state of your life and make history essentially null. But I think if you use all three in the right amount and with the right sort of like form of thought, purpose in mind, then I think it can be used here.
No, I agree. And then also you can't use too much, but you can't use too little. It's like you can't just ignore history, forget things that's happened, things like Holocaust, Reform, Inquisition. You can't just ignore stuff like that and move on. You can't use too little history and try to change. And also going back to what Ms. Mai was saying earlier, like monumental, yeah, it's like it can discourage you, but it can also make it really rash. Like it's like, oh, I've done this and that. Like so did Napoleon. He's a self-made man. I'm gonna be another Napoleon. Like rash, stupid.
Yeah, and the other part of my question was, do you think, in the same way that it can give people a false sense of hope, do you think it can kind of give them like a false sense of doom if they're looking at like a old government being like, wow, they had like this and that problem, look how they just fell apart, like we need to, and kind of act too rashly off of that, or is it always going to be that hopeful?
I think it can, but I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, because when you see past failures, it gives you insights onto what not to do in the future, what not to do, what actions not to perform. So I think there's a benefit almost.
And I don't think that's a problem with monumental history. I think that it's the problem with the people who are looking for monumental history. They're the ones who are seeing it as a sense of doom.
Right.
The monumental history isn't in itself doom.
Yeah, because they bring their own preconceived notions and bias into the history.
And something that he says that I kind of just want to read that sort of supports what we're saying is the critic without need, the antiquarian without reverence, the connoisseur of the great who has not the need ability to achieve the great art, such growths which have been alienated from their native soil and therefore have been degenerated and shot up as weeds. So essentially each one to assess or its detriment will sort of bring that failure. So moving on to Connor.
So I did Miss Nerdy's her 10th blog post called Tale of Victors, and basically she talked about how it's the victors, it's the people who are up top, the winners who write history, and I really liked the blog post, and I thought she did a great job. But she asked some very interesting questions at the end of the post. She asked, can we trust monumental history, basically? Can we prevent ourselves from seeing the bias in monumental history, since the victors are the ones who basically write it? So my question was, is monumental history useful to us today, or does it only distort history?
I think that it can definitely distort history, and that that's something that you have to be very wary of. I was just reading this book about the Battle of Algeria and the whole colonialization process, and it's really, it was written from an Algerian perspective, and that makes the history completely different, and it highlights a lot of important things that are totally distorted by the French perspective. So I think that kind of thing also, history can be distorted by the people who write the history, and that you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at monumental
Oh my god,
history.
yeah, I think it's so interesting when you hear the perspective, or even there's movies about it now. The perspective of the Revolutionary War from the American perspective, and then it from the English perspective, and even the propaganda on both sides. It's amazing how people can sort of define the way history happened, with their words.
And it's always the winners typically.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I addressed is that, how much do you hear about how we liberated the concentration camps, but how little do you hear about our own Japanese internment camps? And how I basically said that monumental history definitely has its purpose, and you can look at it as a guide and a teacher and a model, all the things he said, but you also need to look at it in the view of this is a biased opinion. And if you can, like you said, try and see that other side. Try to see the French and Algerian side. Try to see both sides of it, because that's the only way you're going to get a real picture and then judge how you should, learn from that.
I think it can be, obviously, my view when reading that was it can definitely be useful when it's critically examined, right? You just can't take for verbatim what the author wrote, because whatever you read, it's going to have preconceived biases, notions. You have to critically think and compare it to other sources from that time. But bless you, it implies that you don't trust the source completely, whatever you're reading. And it can also, it's helpful because it can tell you about the past. It can tell you about how people thought in the past, their biases, their notions, and that can inform the future.
How would you suggest, say you have a situation where there is only one side though, and you can't have access to another side, because often in history documents will get lost, various things like that. So how would you propose a solution where it didn't involve looking at both sides? What would you suggest a person do in that situation?
I guess there you would kind of have to be hypothetical. You can read it and then try and take a step back and try to since you can't read, try and think what's the opposite of this? How can this contradict itself? How can this go wrong? And I think that's the only way you can really see something if there's only one-sided perspective.
Yeah, something I think that we actually see this implemented in society is within the court of law, the two sides of the case, and you sort of have to weave in between and find the facts. So you can really get a good unbiased opinion of what's going on, but it's always skewed one way or another, so. Okay, well, moving on to me. I did my blog post, I did my analysis on Mr. Gross's blog post called Success and How Bad You Want It. And it's essentially about the American dream, written from the perspective of Alex de Tocqueville. And it just talks about how, his post essentially talks about how Americans have this drive to succeed. And a lot of times it ends with this drive towards wanting material things like money. And now, essentially, he ends it with saying that maybe as Americans or even as humans, we need to focus on things like the material items if we really want to be happy. Sort of going off of this assumption that material things can't bring us happiness. However, my question sort of is posed in the way that says that material things can bring us happiness. And actually, my question is, what if happiness is subjective and material things can make people happy? And it's sort of, countercultural because a lot of people believe that, love and relationships and sort of abstract things really bring someone to full happiness, but I think that things can make people happy. I think it's just essentially balancing out those things. Someone who I think that is very happy is Oprah, and I think that when you look at her, I think she has a lot of money and a lot of things, but I think she also has a lot of spiritual growth too.
I don't know. I might tend to disagree with that, because while they may have a lot of material things, while they may have a lot of money, is that the source of their happiness, or is it their actions? You talked about Oprah, for example. Do you think Oprah gets, obviously her show, she gets the money from that, and sure, it's probably great and stuff, but I don't think in the long run that's going to satisfy someone's happiness. I think it's more the personal relationship she probably makes with the people on her show, the guests. What she does for other people. I haven't seen Oprah probably for like, I don't know, 15 years. I don't know when I was little. But if I remember correctly, she like gives something to her guests at the end or something like that. So maybe materials, they can make you happy insofar as how you give them or give them to other people maybe, or donate them, give of yourself almost, like a bigger concept of it's not the material that makes me happy, it's what I do with the material and helping others that makes me happy.
But I sort of think that like the two work in tandem because like when she gives these things, like or even like when Ellen DeGeneres like gives the family like a new car, you know what I mean? Like that material thing, not only is it what they know they can do with the car, but it's like the object of like having it and knowing that like as an American you just moved up in one level. So I think that like material things do make us happy. You know, when we get that Christmas present, it's not just the person that gave it to us. It's like, oh my God, I have a new like iPhone. I can like use it to call people and like listen to music. So I think the two work together.
I disagree. I don't know. I don't think that true happiness is affected by, things that can change or like. So for me, like I see that more as pleasure. And I think we talked about this a lot last semester. What is the difference between true happiness and pleasure? And like all of the situations, I view it as pleasure and not as happiness. Because I think that happiness is way more long-standing than that and isn't affected by, really just basically like things that you require.
And I also know, like, knowing Oprah, she, like, opened a whole school in Africa, like, just for little girls to go and, like, have an education, things like that. So you have to see, like, is her real happiness because she's thinking, like, wow, I just gave everybody in my show, like, a car? Or is it thinking, like, like, I came here and, like, I made a difference. Like, all those little girls are going to have an opportunity now, like, because of me. Like, I've made this world, like, a little bit better in my time here. And, like, she didn't do that. She used her money, she used her material things, but I think it's the effect that really was beneficial.
Yeah, and there's like the old joke that says, like money can't buy happiness, but I sure as hell like would rather cry in a Mercedes than on a bicycle. So I think that like in the long run, you're talking about like this sort of idea of pleasure and long-term happiness. I think that the little bits of pleasure in our life sort of contribute to the long-term happiness, and they can sort of build off of each other. But I think that material items really do help us to be happier, and that's my opinion.
I think that part of the thing also is that it also may seem like it makes us happier for longer because it might make our life easier. Like, for example, getting a new car. Say you have an old, crappy car that doesn't work half the time, so you go out to start it and you end up having to walk to work. You get a new car, every time you get ready to go to work, you're going to be happy because you know your car is going to start and you won't ever have to walk to work in, like, say, a foot of snow or something. So I can see both sides, but I can also say that I don't think material things always make you happy because I've received a lot of gifts and gotten things in my life, and some of them make me happy for longer times than others, but I also, being away from my family, I realize how happy that they have made me throughout my life by just spending time with them and enjoying like trips to the zoo and stuff. That has made me very happy compared to just getting a present.
Yeah, and I think one of the lines that I really like from Pocavelli, he says, the passion for material well-being is essentially a middle-class passion, right? There's something like Americans, he talks about in democracies, how we're judged not by honors, ranks, glories, as they are in aristocratic countries specifically, but we're judged by really how much money we have. And I think it's important to note, though, the word well-being, because I think that has a different meaning than to say, like, I'm floating in money, right? Like, it's well-being, to me at least, when I read that, and in the context of that means I have enough to get by, I have enough to satisfy my needs, I have enough to live happily, to do things I enjoy, but I don't have so much money that it's like, I don't know what to do with it, or I'm not like a millionaire. So
And how often do you
that's-
see like the pictures, you hear the stories of like the little kids in Africa who are just like so excited about getting like a pool, like water, or like something like that, compared to like, you like go into like
But I mean,
Target
the
and
pool
see
of water
kids
is still a
throwing
material
fish.
thing.
But you can see like little kids throwing a bit of a material thing. Like obviously it's not, you see these kids who have nothing, who are just like happy over like being alive and going to school and doing whatever. You see like the kids who have everything just want more and more and more. And I think that that's the problem with material goods, is if you're looking for material happiness, you're always going to be searching for more materials to give you happiness.
Yeah, I mean, last thoughts really quickly, sorry. My thing is that like all of those things put you in like a happy mood, but is being in a happy mood happiness? Because I don't think it is.
All right. Great thoughts. Moving on to
Yeah.
Tori, Miss Mally. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
I chose to analyze Ms. Hanneman's blog post on titled "Should History Be Immortal?" And in this blog post, she talks about if history should be immortal in relation to monumental history, is the section that this was in. And she states that Nietzsche would believe that history should not be immortal. Do you agree or disagree with what Nietzsche believes? And if history was immortal, do you think it would be extremely detrimental to life?
I don't think that history can be immortal. That's my thing. Not that whether it should or shouldn't be. Just, one day the earth is going to blow up, the sun will explode, and the earth will go
I'm
into
sorry,
a
just to
black hole.
clarify 1 second. That was Miss Husband's post.
Yeah.
Should issue
Yeah.
I wrote that. What? I went over writing that. Sorry.
No, it's okay. So I just don't think that history is ever going to last. Nothing is immortal. Here. History isn't immortal. It can't be.
Yeah, I would agree with Nietzsche on this one actually as well. I don't think that you can make history immortal, but that doesn't mean people don't try. I think even if you look at the past, right? No, history,
No, it's
people
true.
try to, Napoleon, for example, if you look at ancient Roman empires, what did they try to do? They built these huge monuments to themselves. Why? Because they can be immortalized, right? And even in old plays, even in our discussion Friday, we talked about the Washington Monument. What was the point of that? Try to immortalize the legacy that Washington left to Americans. But is it effective? No, because as new sources come along, as new concepts, new ideas, maybe we found this old historical document that wasn't in existence anymore, we start to have new ideas as to what this person did. Like Christopher Columbus, everyone used to think, oh, what a great guy, right? All this new information is now coming out saying, oh, well, he used Indians and he did all
But we
this.
still talk about it. And I think that's the point of making history immortal. Is
And
how
we
we
celebrate
talk
it.
about it and we celebrate it.
But the celebrations are it depends who you ask, because
Connor, every little kid knows in 1492, Christopher Columbus celebrated.
Those
Right.
kids won't last forever. This
But-
world will last forever.
but
So
is
it's
it
new
Guys,
kids.
Everyone-
I think there are some things in this world that may not be. The word immortal is very. It's a rigid word. I don't like to use it, but I do think that there are things that are going to last for a very long time.
Well, isn't the point of history to be immortal? What is the point of remembering history if you're not trying to remember everything from the past?
You
really-
want something to live after you
Yeah,
die.
exactly. There
Yeah.
isn't really, there would be no history if it wasn't for the sense of trying to keep it immortal.
But back to the Christopher Columbus, and everyone we could say now knows who he is. No, this is just a point about immortal history, though. Everyone also 200-300 years ago used to know who Charlemagne was. How many of us learned about that? How many of us learned Charlemagne? How many of us learned about ancient? Yeah, but I'm just saying, it shows immortality changes with the different generations because these different people crop up and they replace the whole.
So then it is an immortality. 'cause
But
it's-
is immortality defined as talking about it or it being in a textbook and us knowing?
That's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking by immortality. I'm just saying having records of it. Storing. We don't necessarily have to talk about not everybody learns about Charlemagne, but he's still there. People still people get majors and masters on Charlemagne alone, and then Christopher Columbus. First of all, I'm Puerto Rican, so obviously that's a huge part for me. Everybody in Puerto Rico knows Christopher Columbus, but maybe I don't know, some kid in Poland doesn't. Because I think history that concerns you, your heritage. and
Definitely.
culture.
Yeah.
That's
But-
what
That's back to the point.
I think that it is okay for people to try and aim because you mentioned that people try to become immortal through history, and I don't think there's a problem with that. I don't think that affects life in any negative way because it gives someone they want to something they want to shoot for, and I don't think anything's wrong with that. Even think about yourselves. You want to know that you'll be remembered after you die because that means you made some kind of difference, whether it was good or bad. Because look at Hitler. He made a terrible effect on a lot of people, but he's still remembered to this day, even though he's gone. And I don't think you can blame anyone for wanting that. I think you just want to hope that they're trying to make a difference in a positive way so that they're remembered positively.
But if you think about what Nietzsche says about history and how that it should really only serve, the people in the present.
Right.
Becoming immortal in history doesn't really have a purpose for the present, I mean, it could if people look back and they get inspired by the things that you do, but if you're truly doing something just to be remembered by it, is that really a good reason to be remembered forever?
Is it worth doing it at all?
Yeah.
Or is that contributing to the original thought that we talked about here, this idea of governments and society doing things for the greater good or for their own personal gain? Just tie it going. All right, that's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again. Actually, we will not. This is the last one. So thank you for joining us.